Okay, so my name is Stacy, and I am working in the nonprofit and humanitarian aid sectors. And I am following up on part one, a video about moral injury that was about what is it and how to recognize it, and then how to mitigate the risk of it. And now we're going to look at part two. If I can get in here to the right screen, we're going to look at part two. And part two is all about if you suspect someone is suffering from moral injury, then what do you do about it? How do you help them? So, first of all, there we go. Let's talk about what you might notice. Okay, so there are some things that you might notice in someone that suffers from moral injury. And if you want to know the definition of moral injury and some examples and all that, please go back and watch part one of this series. But here, a person who suffers from moral injury is probably going to experience a difficulty trusting others, maybe a loss of faith, or a loss of trust in God. Maybe they don't trust themselves to do good or make good decisions. And part of that is wrapped up in that guilt and blame, self-blame. They may avoid all emotions in order not to feel the painful ones. And that's not always a conscious thing. It's something that just subconsciously, very maybe apathetic, may have a very negative self-image, you might notice. All right. So keep in mind that researchers now believe that the high military suicide rate can be largely attributed to moral injury. It's not uncommon among those who suffer from moral injuries. You might also notice attempts at self-harm as well as suicide. You might notice just a increasing hopelessness and despair, an inability or unwillingness to accept help from others, and really increasing isolation. You might notice that they have a difficult time talking about forgiveness, and definitely unable to accept forgiveness for what they perceive as their transgressions, either from God or even to forgive them their own self. So we need to remember two really important things, and that is moral injury occurs on a spectrum. And so I mentioned this in the last video, that something that is experienced by two people, to one person, it could just be sort of bruising, in their soul or their spirit, but to another person, it could be deeply impacting. So moral injury occurs across this spectrum, much like traumatic stress. So what could be very wounding to one person may not be as wounding to another person. They may need different levels of support. And also, just certain events are more damaging to people, especially the more grievous the harm, the intentionality of the harm. So one of the things we know is that man made or man initiated events, harmful events, are more damaging as far as trauma goes. But things that are intentional are more harmful to people, whether it's emotionally or psychologically. So also keeping in mind that when you're assessing someone for moral injury, I mean, you don't have to be a psychologist or a psychiatrist to understand moral injury, just like you don't have to be a specialist to understand the basics of trauma and post-traumatic stress. But trauma and traumatic stress and moral injury may share some common symptoms. So in fact, a person could actually be suffering from both of those things at the same time. Some of the shared symptoms you might see would be reliving the event through nightmares, avoiding reminders of the event, experiencing some hypervigilance. It could express as anger or anxiety. You could also notice that depression and sadness the person feels. So the key elements that are fairly unique to post-traumatic stress and PTSD, which is a post-traumatic stress disorder, it's a diagnosis, but those elements are that intense fear and the sense of helplessness. Whereas a couple of fairly unique things to watch out for in moral injury is that deep feeling of shame or guilt, sorrow, regret, and the resulting alienation from others, and that isolation, almost that sense of if they knew me, they would not want to be near me, or it really impacts moral injury, cuts to the core of a person's identity, who they are. So, important things to know about moral injury. Soul wounds are not easily healed. These injuries go so deep, and they often do, as I said, they reshape a person's perception of themselves and perceptions of others. Their identity is impacted. They may question their own ability to make good decisions and to act rightly or justly. And they may lose trust in others or in God, because if you watch the first video, you know that one of the ways people can be morally injured is when others transgress what they believe is right, and or they could be injured by being part of an organization or an institution that transgresses, and they it may be that they lose trust in the organization, they lose trust in institutions, and then ultimately they may lose trust in other people and in God. So if you suspect someone's been morally wounded, there are some things you can do to aid in helping them to heal. And first of all, a person with a moral injury, much like someone who's been impacted by trauma, they may find it helpful to talk to a trustworthy person. And this person is a listener who does not judge their story and does not judge the part they played in the story. The good listener doesn't minimize their feelings or rush to offer assurance of forgiveness. Because moral injury um, is a deep wound, and it takes time to process that. And so, for someone, if someone's feeling guilty about something they did, and then we come to them and we quickly try to reassure them, it's okay, God forgives you, I forgive you, you didn't mean to do it, it wasn't your fault. That sounds like the right thing to say, but that's often just not helpful. And it may cause the person to shut down because they feel that you're not listening. And so there's a time to really sit with people's guilt or the shame they feel. Um, and we don't have to emphasize it or exacerbate it. We can say things like, it sounds like you were in a very difficult spot. It sounds like you had no good, um, there was no good decision there, whatever. But we just affirm that we hear them, that we're listening. And the other thing is, because moral injury is a wound of the soul, it can be helpful for the person to confess their story to a moral or spiritual authority. And that could be a pastor, a rabbi, a priest, just someone that they see as a spiritual authority, not necessarily who you see as a spiritual authority. Um, and even if you don't think they need to confess anything, um, this is what might be helpful for them. It might be cleansing and cathartic for them to have that act of confession. So, another thing that can help people eventually and in the right time is a biblical understanding of forgiveness. And just that they would begin to accept forgiveness from others, from God, and eventually to forgive themselves. But again, remember, this wound goes deep, and it can really take time for that to happen. So, exposing them to true forgiveness and true biblical forgiveness, and not dismissing the need for that. And it's also just a time for patience from other people, because it may take a while for someone to realize and internalize forgiveness for themselves, and it takes time for them to accept it from others. Um, Other things that may help in healing, well, some people are greatly helped when they can make amends or restitution in some meaningful way for something. Some transgressions are real transgressions that someone committed, and whether it was intentional or not intentional, they still live with the guilt and the shame of that. And so, can they make amends in some way, in a way that's meaningful to them, and it may be meaningful, hopefully, if there's a person or a group that they have wounded or harmed. It's not always possible. There may be some substitutionary act that could help them to take responsibility. when needed and to express their sorrow and remorse. Because there's a strong temptation to withdraw and isolate when moral injury happens, it can be helpful to encourage and even assist someone in connecting with others as much as possible and maybe reestablishing relationships that are strained or even broken um, during the person experiencing this. Many people who suffer from moral injury are also helped by serving others in order to give back. And if this is done in a healthy way, it can be very healing, not in a way to earn forgiveness or acceptance, but really just to develop a sense of meaning and purpose for them. Finally, special spiritual rituals or ceremonies can be very healing. They can be healing markers that have to do maybe with cleansing or forgiveness. So, an example I heard of once was a military chaplain who held ceremonies for soldiers when they were leaving the front lines, and the soldiers would write down on slips of paper, as the chaplain led them in this, the terrible things they had done or witnessed on the front lines. And then they would gather around, for them, it was a cross, and they would have a prayer for cleansing and forgiveness. And the priest, the chaplain who was a priest, would gather the papers, and then they burned them in a bowl. And then he took a wash basin and went around to each of the soldiers and washed their hands as they outstretched their hands while praying. And so that was the cleansing ceremony or ritual that was marked the end of their tour there. So now, of course, this is just one step in a long recovery, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. But, the thing that happened, the priest understood the power of ceremony before sending those soldiers home. And I just want to encourage each of you that's watching this video to think about the people you care for. Which ones have struggled with moral dilemmas during this pandemic? Those people, you need to check in on them. Surely your healthcare workers around the globe are facing some pretty unprecedented decisions right now. How can we better prepare them, but also minister to them in their soul wounds in this season? So, thank you for watching, and I hope that it's been helpful to you.